come to this geometric structure? Well, if you study the Egyptians, the Mayans, the Incas, all these people, the Indians, all these people, they all did this crazy geometry thing. And they talked about it in various ways. But what is most impressive is that they left very tangible things out there that had to do with geometry. And the things they left out there, if they were little models, 3 feet high with, easy to build, you'd say, well, they must have instinctively figured this out, right? But if they leave behind something like this, it brings a whole new set of questions to the forefront. And that is, how were they able to pull this off? Okay? Listen, I know that you've heard a lot of stories from your schooling about how pyramids were built. And I know that they told you mostly that these pyramids were built in a very specific way, and that's a fact. That is, between, depending on the theory, 20,000 to 100,000 slaves or farmers that during the Nile flooding every year would go and build pyramids. And they built them, depending on the theories, between 20 and 40 years, period. And all this. And that's all nice and dandy. And you have to realize that they teach this as fact. For instance, when you read in those books, it says, well, the pyramids were built by, not may have built by, nothing like that. It's like facts. And you think, well, that must be it, right? But when you think about it, those people that are writing these facts are not engineers. They're not physicists. They don't necessarily understand what it takes to build things. They don't necessarily understand how difficult it is to get great precision from building with stones. They don't necessarily understand that copper doesn't cut stone, and that so far copper hasn't been found to be able to be hardened to cut stone, and so on. So they just throw this stuff out there, and because they have PhDs and they're in the 1800s and they can't imagine of anything else, then everybody goes with that. And I assure you, if you're doing a PhD in Egyptology or in antiquity, in ancient civilization studies or so on, and you write a thesis that these were built in any other way, you're probably not going to get your PhD. And so I was really kind of stunned because I started to study it, because to me, I had solved a lot of these issues, but there was something that just kept on nagging at me. Is like, maybe the history of the earth, maybe the history of our civilization is quite different than what we think it is. And if that's true, I want to know why. Because then I could modify my view of evolution to match the true reality of what happened out there. And that could change a lot of things in the way I think of myself and my ancestors and the way things have been done and my place in the universe. So I started to study these things, and I tell you, when you start studying these things, just a little, and I'm in contact with a lot of physicists, so if I can't run the math, I can ask people their opinion and so on. And when you study these things just a little, right away, you're confronted with amazing, amazing data. For instance, the Grand Pyramid at Giza is 481 feet tall. It's built out of 2,300,000 stones in average, approximately. And the base of the pyramid is 13 acres square. Okay? when they placed the last stones on the top of the Grand Pyramid of Giza, which we don't have at this point. You see, the stone on the Grand Pyramid of Giza were ripped out. See, there was a covering on the stones all over the pyramid that was mined to build Cairo in the early 1900s and late 1800s. And so these stones were extremely perfect. The pyramids was much more perfect before. But still to this day, when you look at the immensity of the building and then you get satellite mapping of the apex of the pyramid, the apex is 1/4 of an inch off the center of a 13-acre square base. I don't know if we have builders in the crew here today, but I guarantee you this type of achievement, after having placed 2,300,000 stone, is not anything any engineering firm with all of the money in the world and the technology we have is able to reproduce today. I assure you. We cannot do that. We cannot reproduce that. You have to divide 1/4 of an inch by 2,300,000 stones to be able to get the accuracy of the placements of the stones. It's a very amazing thing. And then by the time they were done, the orientation of the pyramid to the stellar pole and so on, the way the pyramid is oriented and so on is extremely accurate, more accurate than many of our current buildings, including telescopes and such. The size, the enormous size of the building is beyond any comprehension. And there's another issue that's very, very dramatic. There is blocks in the Grand Pyramid, in the King's Chamber. There's 100 blocks of granite that have been hoisted to up to 130 feet of elevation in the Grand Pyramid and placed in perfect accuracy to create a relief of the pressure of the stones above with very amazing engineering, so that the whole thing holds together in a way that that is unmatchable with all of our technology today. There's another problem, okay, in archaeology here. Archaeology is really the art of decoding text, decoding the remains of a civilization, and from these decoding, extrapolating their morses, their behavior, their day-to-day life, and so on. Well, if you follow that path, you would expect that somewhere in Egypt, after having placed thousands and thousands and thousands of hieroglyphs in all the temples and tombs and everywhere, okay, telling us everything about the behaviors of their Morses, like what they ate, how they went to the washroom, what they did, and how they did it, and everything. I mean, they tell us everything, how they made love and everything, right? That somewhere somebody would have mentioned, oh, by the way, we built the pyramids too. Don't you think? I mean, you'd expect that, right? But not one wall says that. Nothing in Egypt says we built the pyramids. Nothing in Mayan country says we built the pyramids. Nothing in Inca tradition says we built the pyramid. You know how they tell you that the pyramids were built as tombs. And these tombs were there to have the Pharaoh be buried into, right? You've all heard that. And you would expect that the reason they're telling you that is that they found mummies of pharaohs in pyramids. And typically when you look at the books or when you look at the reports from Egypt and so on, they typically show the pharaoh's tombs and then cut to the pyramids and show this all together in a way that you think that you're looking at this pharaoh tomb and it's in a pyramid. Well, it's a fact, however, that not one mummy was ever found in a pyramid. Not only in Egypt, but anywhere else in the world for that matter. Okay? In Egypt particularly, mummies were all found in underground vaults that have nothing to do with the pyramids. So when you think that a pharaoh that built this huge monument to have himself buried in it would at least put on the front, a little epitaph, so and so from this year to this year, we built this pyramid to bury myself, whatever. There is pyramids in Egypt that were completely sealed when they were found, including the Grand Pyramid at Giza. And the archaeologists, at the time almost treasure hunters, had to dynamite their way in many of these pyramids. They couldn't find an entrance. The entrances were plugged with immense 20-ton boulders that was so well matched to the rest of the pyramid, they couldn't find an entrance. So they would dynamite their way in, and in the case of the Grand Pyramid, they fell into a tunnel, and then they backtracked to the entrance, and then they could clear the plugs. And then typically, in some of these pyramids, they would get to the sarcophagus, and the sarcophagus would still be sealed. And it would have a slab of granite on top of it that weighed in excess of 20 tons. And they would lift the slab with great difficulties, unseal the supposed tomb, and find it empty, completely empty. What was their conclusion? Tomb robbers got there before them. The tomb robbers somehow found the entrance, removed the plug, went in there, took all the treasures, removed the mummy body, lifted the lid, removed the body, took all the rest of the stuff, cleaned everything up, put the lid back on, sealed it back up, went back out, closed the plug, redid everything good, and walked out of there. I don't think so. And so there is huge difficulties in this. There is huge difficulties in these theories. Those are theories. They're not facts. And when you examine these theories, they have immense holes in them. Very large holes that involves thousands of tons of material. So for instance, you have things like the Sphinx. The Sphinx is right in front of the pyramids at Giza. The Sphinx, unlike a lot of people think, is not actually a built model, but is actually a carved statue, carved right out of the Giza Plateau. And there's very interesting things. Now, if you were commissioned to build the Sphinx, what would you do? Now, you've got this huge plateau with this, very good rock in it to carve, and you would want to start carving. So you have to cut the enclosure around the Sphinx body to be able to carve the body. And what they did here is that instead of moving out of the enclosures, little blocks that you would see here, you see, out of the enclosure, if it was you that was commissioned, you'd probably remove 100 pound block, maybe 200-pound block, maybe 500-pound. If you have a good crane, maybe up to like 1,000-pound, maybe 2,000-pound. You wouldn't, I mean, why would you try to remove anything bigger, right? It'd be easier to, to deal with. You move things that match your level of technology. You don't move things that makes it difficult for you to move them, right? Well, the Egyptian somehow, supposedly, moved these blocks from the enclosure. Now, these blocks are known to have come out of the enclosure because the stratas on the blocks match exactly where the strata is here, and you can actually tell where each block goes. And these blocks weigh in the excess of 200 tons. Now, these guys, seemingly 4,000 years ago, was moving 200-ton blocks casually, and not only just moving them, but stacking them. Okay? To create what is known as the Valley Temple or the Sphinx Temple in front of the Sphinx. Those are very, very disturbing pieces of data. They are not simply and easily dealt with or, pushed under the carpet. The Sphinx as well has all sorts of erosions on it that do have impact on our concepts of when the Sphinx was built or carved. New evidence has shown that the erosion that you find on the Sphinx body and then on the Sphinx enclosure, this is the enclosure from where the 200-ton blocks were relieved. The erosion that's seen here demands that there was large amount of rain for long periods of time to create it. We know historically and geologically that the amount of rain needed to create that type of erosion could only happen up to 10,000 years ago after the last ice age. That would mean that the Sphinx was not carved 4,000 years ago, but maybe up to 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. So now you have an even larger archaeological problem. You've got people 10,000 years ago going around with 200-ton blocks. It's a serious issue at that point. There is another temple that's a very important temple in Egypt that's not so well known and recognized, that is very well guarded at this time, that is an anomaly in Egyptian buildings. This is called the Orion Temple. This is fresh from Abydos. And these blocks are polished pink granite in excess of 100-ton to 200-ton blocks stacked and organized into this incredible building. Now, look at the size of this block above his head. There are tongues and grooves. It's very highly engineered. You got to realize that we're talking about Egyptian here that's supposed to not have the wheel. They don't have the pulley. They don't have a crane to grab things and put them on top of things. Certainly not things that big. And this temple is typically as well a big controversy because, as you see, there's water on the bottom of it. It typically floods annually or almost all the time because it's below the Nile level. The temple is dug into the ground. So when the archaeologists first found it, they said, oh, the Egyptian dug and then built from there. but there's no other evidence in Egypt that the Egyptian would do that to build the temple. And when geologists look at the sides of the temple, they notice that the geological layering on the side of the temple would make it so that it's actually the other way around. The temple was there, and then the sedimentation from the Nile generated all the layers that eventually buried the temple. And then the archaeologists, lady archaeologists, found it and dug it out. Now, that would make this temple much older than previously believed. Like right now is being dated at about 4,000 years old. It would ask that that temple was there approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. And eventually I came across these things that are thought to have been popularized now as the flower of life. Here's another picture of it. Again, those are fresh pictures. It's very difficult to find these pictures. You can study, I studied this temple all the way back to the original papers that were published on it, and I was never able to get one of these pictures, and actually really glad to have them now. And you can see them again, and so they're high on the pillars. And what's really amazing about this graph, this geometry that's imprinted on the granite, is that it's not cut, it's not etched into the granite, it's burnt into the atomic structure of the granite. It's burnt onto it like if it was laser burnt on the granite. And that poses a very large problem when you're thinking of 10,000 years ago, people going around burning stuff with lasers. Interestingly, when you take this geometry and you extrapolate it into 3D structures, now each circle becomes a sphere. The petals that we were discussing earlier, or the lobes we were discussing earlier, appears, and if you place a tetrahedron in each sphere, you get the 64 tetrahedron grid. The reason I'm mentioning all this is that there's evidence that there's people in this world that were able to do things in a manner that's completely different than how we do things today, and that exceed our capacity to do them today with all of our technology. Maybe, just maybe, because our technology is based on reactive, explosive technologies instead of contractive space-time curvature technologies, which would allow us to control gravitational fields and so on. These Egyptians had hieroglyphs as well that represented their highest level of initiation. The highest level of initiation that had to do with those sun gods. And these higher level of initiation always related, or typically related, to the eye of Horus. And when they used this hieroglyph in their writing, it's interesting to note that when they did, they used each part of the eye for a specific fraction of mathematics, and that each fraction went on towards the 1/64th fraction, which is the dynamics of the division of tetrahedron array in space. The other thing is that these 200-ton blocks were not their only level of achievement. This statue has been found in the middle of the desert, a few hundred miles away from the quarry where it was cut. And it's a statue is believed to be of Ramses II, I believe. And it's a granite statue, extremely highly polished, that is made out of one block of granite that weighs in excess of 1,000 tons. 1,000 tons. These are very, very large anomalies. There's not just pyramids in Egypt. There's pyramids in many other countries, in South America and in Mexico and so on. And most people don't know, now remains of pyramids have been found in many other countries. This is Japan, underwater, near the island of Okinawa. These are the remains of pyramids that went under the water a very long time ago. What's great about pyramids that went underwater is that when they do, you get organic growth on it. See, when you're dating things, and you're using carbon dating, when you do so, you can carbon date things that have carbon in it that is organic life. So, for instance, when they carbon date pyramids in South America and so on, they say, well, you know, we'll carbon date this guy that was buried beside it, or we'll carbon date, you know, this campfire, or we carbon date what we find here, and then they extrapolate that these people were the builders of the pyramid. But when a thing like that goes under the water, then coral growth happens. And that is organic life. So you can carbon date at least when it went under the water. And when this was carbon dated, then it showed that this pyramid must have gone underwater 10 to 12,000 years ago, at the flooding of the last ice age. Now that would be when it went underwater. That is not necessarily when it was constructed. This is a picture of a pyramid that was found. It was found as a result of an error that a Second World War American pilot did while flying over China, and he came across this. He was lost, and he came across this pyramid and took a black and white picture of it. And it was published, and a lot of people screamed to hoaxes and everything. And I used to never show that in my presentation because there was too much controversy about it. There's over 100 different pyramids in China. And people in general don't know that. They're very, very large. Some of them, they're very typical. They resemble very much the pyramids of South America and Mexico. Here's a satellite picture of them. You can see them here. And interestingly, when you look very closely at the satellite pictures of the pyramids, you find that they resemble very much so what we find at Giza. This is China, this is Giza, and this is Teotihuacan off north from Mexico City. Same angles, same alignments, and all of these alignments match the stars of the belt of Orion. And that I find very interesting. Because many of the civilizations talked about these advanced beings coming from the Orion constellation and the star Sirius. And so maybe they left us evidence of their passage. Now, when you go to the sacred sites of the knowledge of the sun gods from the Chinese tradition, you go to the Forbidden City, and at the entrance of the city, typically you have the Sphinx. The Sphinx, both in Egypt and in China and other traditions, is considered the guardian of knowledge and is usually placed at the entrance, and they guard the knowledge. And the interesting thing about those statues that guard the knowledge in the case of the Sphinx, it's thought that the knowledge is guarded under the paws of the Sphinx. Now, interestingly, Edgar Casey said that we were going to find chambers under the paws of the Sphinx, and now with seismological equipment, they've been able to find chambers. They seem to be chambers under the paws of the Sphinx. But what's under the paws of this guardian? Well, when you look carefully, he's guarding the knowledge, which is a sphere with the lobes of the geometry of space embedded in it. And again, we find this information just percolating all around the world in these places where there's incredible buildings, incredible amount of knowledge. And, you know, sure enough, these traditions in China are linked to the knowledge of the I Ching and the Yin Yang. And the Yin Yang is the torus viewed from above, as we saw earlier. And then the I Ching is made out of 64 symbols, each symbol being made out of 6 sticks, right? And the way you define each symbol relative to each other is that the sticks are either broken or full. And usually they are arranged in a circle like so, where 1 is in opposition to 64, 2 is in opposition to 63, 3 is in opposition to 62, and so on. And each one has the same number of full stick and the same number of broken stick. It's just that they're arranged differently between 2 pairs. Now, I was looking at this, and again, I was in my van decoding this a long time ago, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, if I take 6 sticks and I put them together in a geometry, if they're the same length, then the only geometry I can generate out of those 6 sticks is a tetrahedron. And I thought, okay, that kind of works, so maybe the code has to do with tetrahedrons. But what would it be about the broken sticks? What are the broken sticks about? What's going on? Smaller tetrahedrons, what's going on? And it took me a while to figure this out, but eventually I realized that when you follow the code of the I Ching, it goes 164, and they're in opposition. So if you took 1, this is 1 here, and then this is 64, and you put them together, then the sticks have to intersect. And that's why you have the broken sticks, because when they intersect, they get broken. Bang, 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 bang. And here's your star tetrahedron structure. And so you can continue to build the I Ching, okay, and follow the code and continue to build the star tetrahedron structure with the positive and the negative and the positive and the negative. And by the time you're finished, you will have a 512 tetrahedron grid, which is just happens to be the next fractal level from 64. So then you have all the fractal, progression. It's very important. I mean, these are fundamental beliefs that we have around the world. They're very important traditions that have very important sets of data that are telling us about the structure of space-time, that are telling us about the dynamics of space-time. In 1972, Carl Sagan and a bunch of other astrophysicists figured, well, we've got the Arecibo radio telescope all set up now, so let's go out there and write a code and send the strongest signal ever sent into space so that we could reach out to those people out there in the galaxy. Maybe they can capture this code and then send a reply. Now that would still take hundreds and hundreds of years for that to happen, but it was worth at least doing it. So what they did is they got together and they figured, okay, what kind of simple code can we write? And obviously that's a binary code, and if you did a punch card of this code, it would look like this, and it says that we're made out of carbon. It says this is our table of elements. It says that's our DNA structure, and it says we have a small head, a big body, and we live on the third planet from our sun. And this is the technology we're sending this with, which is the symbol for a radio telescope. Well, nothing happened, obviously, because it would take hundreds of years for that to come back. But that's assuming that they're way out there. If they are close to us, orbiting, in our solar system, they would have got it very, very quickly. In any case, it wasn't until 2001, I believe, that the reply came back. Did you know that we had been talked to directly? Well, right beside a radio telescope that's typically hired by SETI to listen for extraterrestrial signals, a crop circle occurred in the middle of the night, right across from the highly secured gate, which has guards and infrared cameras and everything. And this crop circle came together, this reply punch card came together with a mugshot. Right? They thought we'll give them a little bit more than a binary code. This crop circle structure is very complex. Not very easily hoaxed at all. If you look at the way the hay is woven into the field, it's very complex, very difficult to reproduce in order to get this face structure in it, viewed from above. And as well, nobody saw anything there, and certainly there's security. And the reply is pretty straightforward, binary code. Now, when the binary code was decoded, it said something a little different from ours. It said that they were made out of carbon and silica. So that's interesting. There's been people have been talking about becoming the crystal being, or I talk about human beings as biocrystals all the time. But what is important here is what I found interesting is that since then, this data that has come out that says that, in fact, it's not quite accurate to call ourselves carbon life, because when you look into the fluids inside cells and inside the nuclei of cells, you find that there's actually more silica than previously believed, a lot more. And actually we're more like silica and carbon combined together. So maybe they were just being more accurate than us. And here they talk about their table of elements, which is very similar. And then their DNA seems to have one more strand to it. They have a big head, a small body. They live on 3 of the planets in their solar system, and the third one has 4 moons. And this is the technology that they're sending this with. And I mean, this should have made the 5 o'clock news. But it didn't. And it's interesting that the SETI comments on this was, well, you know what? The radio telescope was right beside it. So why didn't they just send a radio signal, right? And if this is true, why didn't they just send a radio signal? And my reasoning for that, my answer to that is that, well, maybe they wanted the rest of the world to have the information. Because if they would have sent a radio signal, I assure you that stuff would have not made it on the local radio station. So this is really first contact. This is them talking back. Are we listening? Well, Interestingly, when I looked at the bottom of that punch card, I was very, very intrigued, going, well, what is that technology down there? I'd like to know. Maybe it works with what I'm doing. And sure enough, you see, but you can't do anything with it because it's so low resolution. The code is so simple. So I couldn't really do anything with it. And then it was found that the exact same field in England, a year prior to this card, this punch card appearing in it, across the same radio telescope, they had given us the answer to what's at the bottom of the punch card. The exact same geometry. They had given the answer before we asked the question. The same radio telescope with the same security guards and all this. They didn't see nothing. And this, again, is a beautiful fractal division of space based on tetrahedral arrays. Again, here we see singularity, boundaries formation, and then duplication of the boundaries with radial expansion in a tetrahedron array. So we have huge stones that in some cases are found hundreds of miles from the quarry where they were cut. Extremely precise buildings all around the world. Ancient societies, oral and written traditions that talks about sun gods coming from the stars. And even today, thousands and thousands of very powerful evidence of unidentified flying objects. You might wonder, why are these beings not communicating with us directly anymore? Well, that may be because our society has grown to be quite violent. However, couldn't we learn from the information they left for us thousands of years ago? Is there evidence that these beings were here prior and that they left, or they left us to figure things out until maybe we evolved to a level where they could contact us again? These are the skull of Tutankhamun and his brother. This is the bust of Nefertiti, all showing elongated heads. Typically, in ancient Egyptian tradition, the sun gods had very elongated head, and the semi-sun gods, which were the progenitor of the normal humans having babies with sun gods, would have not so elongated head. This is a skull that was found in South America, in temples in South America. This is enormous in proportion and cannot be the result of binding of the head. The reason why that is not possible is that when you bind the head of a child so that you deform the skull features, then this binding of the head deforms the skull features but does not increase the volume of the skull cavity. In this case, the volume of the skull cavity is almost twice the size of a normal human being. Now, if there was only one of these that were found, you would say, well, maybe it was an anomaly, maybe it was a deformity. Well, there's all sorts of things that makes it not so. For instance, the jaw bones, the feature on the cheeks bones are not Homo sapien. They're more of the Neanderthal and mix of various evolution in the evolution chain that we believe is linear in evolution of man, and they shouldn't be all combined in the same skull. The other problem is that there's not just one of these skulls that was found, but multiple skulls that were found like this in temples around South America and Mexico. This one is a little bit different, as you see. It's not as pointed. Still enormous. and still has some of these unusual features in their facial features and the jaw features. Others found in Mexico is these melon heads, where those actually have even a larger volume capacity inside the head, very large eye sockets, and a very strange structure of the skull. This is not the largest skull ever found. The largest volumic cavity of the skull occurred on this, that was found with this skull. And this is like the M kind of structure skull, where the hemispheres seem to have developed in independence, and very, very large skull. The front portion of the skull are missing, but the plates of the skull are all there, and they're very large in volume. So these are physical evidence you can touch of these beings having been around in ancient antiquity. You find them, stories about these beings, everywhere. You find them in Mayan tradition, Inca tradition. They both call them the sun gods. In the Egyptian tradition, in the Chinese tradition, calls them the sun gods as well. The Japanese tradition, pretty well all around the world. In the Mayan tradition as well, you find grids like so that have mathematical information on them that are thought to be calendars, very precise calendars about the changes in our solar systems, and interesting symbols that have these vortices that are interacting. And when you look at the math from these codes, you find that they match the 64 tetrahedron growth structure of space-time that we've been discussing all day. This is some of the oldest tradition on Earth. It has very, very ancient writing. These plates, this plate in particular, is a creation myth in which the sun gods come to the earth and gives man the black, it's called a black sun in those traditions. It's been translated in various other traditions, for instance in the Quran, as the black stone, okay? And it's described as a very highly radiating sun, like a sun in a box, like a desktop black hole. All right? And the tradition talks about the sun gods coming to the top of the mountain, and the humans going to meet the sun gods, and the sun gods bestowing this on the human. Then you find in these Sumerian traditions that these eventually built very complex, very sophisticated. This is where we're actually bombing right now, Iraq and Iran location, where very, very sophisticated pyramidal structures were built, ziggurats and so on, that were very sophisticated building and very large building structures. This is a view from one of them from above. Many of those are being destroyed as we speak. Many of these artifacts in these traditions are disappearing in museums in those regions as we speak. If you look around those regions, you find other things that are large anomaly. This is one of the largest, most amazing anomaly we have on Earth. It is the stones that were the foundation of an ancient temple on which the Roman Empire erected a more recent temple, afterwards used the old stones as foundations. let me show you the relationship of scale of these stones. This is a person, okay? And this is the stone, okay? It's in approximately 22 feet of elevation and has been raised on smaller stones, still very large stone, but smaller stones that holds them up. There's 3 of them, okay, that are remaining there at this point. They're extremely large. In fact, they weigh in excess, these one there weigh in excess of 800 tons, okay? And this one here, that's in a quarry about a half a mile from the temple there, okay, is in excess of 1,000 tons. Okay, those are extremely large stones that seem to have been moved with ease in antiquity. And that doesn't happen very easily. Other artifacts are found around those region. In this case is a little pot that has an insert that's made out of copper and a little rod. And when you put the thing together and put grape juice in it, it becomes a battery. And it's evidence that they were using these batteries to electroplate things. And so the batteries were found, and they're from a certain epoch that makes them approximately 2,000 years old, except that there is electrolysis that was made on objects that were found that are much older than that, up to 4,000 years old. And these must have been plated with the same principle. So there's evidence that these people were using electricity at the time. Okay? And here's a little reproduction of one of these batteries, and they get about 1.1 volts out of it. And in series, you could use them to electroplate things and do all sorts of stuff. This is very ancient, advanced technology. One of these plates that talks about advanced mathematics has a set of geometric structure combined with these mathematics. And sure enough, when you look closely at this geometric structures on those tablets, which are, you know, in fractal growth, they match perfectly the 64 tetrahedron grid when it's on its side. And here is the match. Amazingly, even with the little lines that go in the middle and so on. Perfect match. The tablets describes a geometric progression of the separation of space. Okay? So all this is evidence, all leading to an understanding that there is, this is the Kaaba in the middle of Mecca. This is actually from my tradition. My grandpa was a guide that brought people from Iran to Mecca, and he brought the prayers of the one that couldn't go, because Islamic people all have to go to Mecca once in their life. And the ones that can't afford it, they're allowed to send somebody else. They always have these good, you know. And so my grandpa was a person that would take the prayers of people and bring them to Mecca. He was a Bedouin. He ride on camel back, and it took 6 months there and 6 months back, so it was a long journey, and he would guide people there. And he went to this place very often, having this job, and more often than most other Muslim around our family, that's for sure. And my father has a news article from the Tehran Press showing a picture of my grandpa with a small article, I think it was just after he passed, showing that my grandpa lived to the age of 128. And so, you know, this is directly linked to my tradition. And when you read the Quran, you find that again in this Quran, in the Kaaba, in the middle cube there, in this geometry, in the middle of this beautiful temple where thousands and thousands of people come to rotate, to torque the field around it, right? And you find that it described that at the center of it is what they call the black stone, or the black sun. In the Quran, it says that it was given by angel Gabriel to Abraham, and that eventually it ended up in the center of Mecca. Maybe we want to take one step back in order to make two steps forward. I'm talking about that. Let's assume that maybe because of all these anomalies around the world where people seem to have been moving extraordinarily large objects with what seemed to be extraordinary ease, that there was a time prior to our written history where on this planet, and prior to serious cataclysms that seem to relate to a flood story that is found around the world in over 500 different traditions, that there was this technology, this power source that allowed things to levitate, that allowed things to move about, that allowed information or energy to move through. And that this power source was given to us by advanced civilization that visited our planet thousands and thousands of years prior to our written history. When you do that, if you were a space traveler going through the galaxy and you found a planet that was very, very low in its technological growth, if they weren't too violent at the time and they didn't have too many means to be violent at the time, it would be easy for you to show up, most likely be thought of as a sun god or a god for certain, and give them, technology that could help them along their path. But what if that path of advancement was too rapid for this evolution? That is, the people that got the technology eventually weren't able to handle it because they hadn't learned enough lessons along their path. Well, you would have to take it back somehow and allow that civilization to grow again and reach that level where they would understand the responsibility that comes with advanced technology. And I'm convinced that that is the lesson we're learning right now.